The topic that we'll be discussing today, it's in and around the market of power transformers. Specifically, we'll be looking at, from the perspective of the Turkish manufacturers, especially the markets which can be potentially served by the manufacturers operating within Turkey, which are the most important markets for these manufacturers in and around the transformer, and specifically for the power transformers. First, let me walk you through the flow of the presentation. I'll just tell you about the company, who we are, and what we do. And then we'll look at the global market overview of the power transformers. Globally, which markets are the most important markets according to us, where we see the most amount of investment going into the power transformers globally. And then we'll be taking one step ahead and then going into the details of some of the specifics of the markets like European market, North America's market, some Gulf countries we'll be discussing, and then at the end we'll be discussing the Turkey's transmission network as well as the impact of power transformers going on within the T&D infrastructure of Turkey. Within these topics, we'll be discussing the market sizing. What is the current market sizing? What is the future forecast within power transformers, as well as what are the key trends? What are the market drivers? Why do we see any growth in the market? Why do we see any decrease in the market? What are the key drivers which are impacting the market of power transformers? Then at the end, we'll take a step back, and from the global perspective, we will look at the supply and demand of the power transformers. What is the utilization rate? What is the idle capacity in terms of the global utilization of power transformers? And then at the end, we'll conclude the presentation. To start with, who we are, actually, Power Technology Research is a market research company. It's a market intelligence company. It provides consulting to the OEMs who are operating within power as well as industrial infrastructure, as well as some of the third-party companies like EPCs who are operating as kind of a middleman between OEMs and the end user for the equipment, like going into the substations as well as in the industrial. Combined, we have 20 years of experience within the market research, and we provide research in terms of the syndicated as well as some custom research for our customers, which is tailored to specific needs for their businesses. How do we do this kind of research? There are different steps that we follow, actually. First is to look into the market sizing, the install base of all this equipment. If we talk about the power, it's what is the install base of, let's say, power transformers or the distribution transformers. Then on top of that, what is the annual market? What are the investments going into the market of transformers or the switchgear annually, and how the future actually looks like for this equipment? And same goes for the industrial automation equipment as well. And then the second step, we look into the comparative analysis. Who is doing what, who is investing in which field, what are the strengths and weaknesses of different players operating within this market. And then at the end, we look at the market accessibility. What are the business practices? Which business practices are followed within these, within the OEMs, within the EPCs, and the utilities as well. Then at the end, we combine this in a package, and then we can help our customers to actually take different decisions whenever they are to enter a new market, whenever they have to decide which market they want to invest in. So this kind of bundle can help them take decisions very easily. Now, to start the topic, first, let's define what we'll be discussing. We will not be discussing the total transformers market, rather we will be looking at the large power transformers, how we define it, and why are we discussing separately the power transformers from the distribution transformers. We'll be discussing it lately. 100 kV is kind of the definition for us within PTR. You can find different definitions for power transformers. However, internally 100 kV plus for the voltage, as well as for capacity 60 MVA is our definition of power transformer, the way we look at the market of power transformers. Once again, why do we have to separate this from the total market, from the transformers market of this power transformers market, is that this is kind of a globally traded product. You'll see power transformers being shipped from one region to the other, from the Asia to the US. So that's why the demand and supply from one region to the other can impact. So that's why it's a globally traded product. It's not bound by the regions or the boundaries. Then it's a custom designed product. It's not a product that you can just go in and get it off the shelf. It is always tailored according to the needs of the end user, that is utilities in this case. So they have to plan this ahead of time. in some cases, in extreme cases, it can be 2 years ahead of time that they have to plan. If they want to install a power transformer, they have to place an order because the lead times can take up to 2 years. Then the efficiency requirements for these power transformers are the highest. If you think about it, these transformers get installed at the top of the ladder, right? Everything gets channeled through these transformers, through these power transformers. So the efficiency requirements for these are the maximum. And that is why the raw materials going into these transformers are also channelized, or also there's a focus on that as well, that what kind of raw material is going in. Specifically, if we talk about electrical steel, that matters a lot in terms of the efficiency. And since we know that this is kind of a product which is produced there are not a lot of producers. In some regions, there is production, and then it's shipped to the other regions. So that's why it is also kind of important in that regard as well. Now let's look at the different markets. Let's see where the most amount of investment is going on. The way we will look at this market of power transformers is from the grid's perspective, is from the substation's perspective. What utilities are planning? Is there any one particular voltage level that they are trying to strengthen within the network? Are they adding more capacity to cope with certain problem that they're facing within their network? So we'll be looking at some of the key factors which are actually impacting this market of power transformers. First of all, if we talk about Asia, definitely India and China are the biggest market at this point. What is actually causing this market to go up at this point is within India, right now there is less transmission capacity, MVA capacity, if you will, is available for the generation capacity. Just to give you some numbers right now, their MVA capacity to actually evacuate the generation, the megawatts, it's 2.3 MVA per megawatt. And their goal is to achieve roughly around 7 MVA per megawatt. So you can imagine it's like more than double the transmission capacity that they plan to add in years to come. And this roughly translates to 292 GVA of transmission capacity being added into the network. So you can imagine how many power transformers they can result into. Same goes for China. A lot of generation is being planned for the years to come. That is why, since this generation is not always located right next to the load points, not right next to the consumption points, so that's why they have to build those electricity highways, if you will, in order to evacuate their power generated from the generation points towards the load centers. So that is why we expect this to drive the market of power transformers. If we look at a market of Indonesia, it's not the biggest one in terms of install base. However, if we look at the plans, they have somewhere around 500 generation and transmission projects being planned within their network. So we expect this to drive the market of power transformers drastically in years to come. Then if we look at some of the GCC countries, some of the events which are going to happen, even if it does not seem that they are going to impact the transmission network, but it is. Some of these events are actually causing as voltages as high as 400 kV being revamped, 132 kV being strengthened just because of these events. However, the utilities actually are using a two-pronged approach, right? One is to install these capacities for these events. However, in the long run, it can help them cope with the transmission capacity requirement of their grid in the long run. Then if we look at the African market, it's one of the markets where we have started, we've seen that the things are starting to happen in the past some years. In terms of the biggest install base, South Africa is the biggest market in terms of install base. However, we expect some of the projects to be delayed because of the recent problem of Eskom. Their credit ranking went down, and we expect that this will actually cause the projects to be delayed in some future years. Nigeria is finally getting the funding for some of the projects that they have announced 2 years ago, so we expect them to start as well in future. In terms of the manufacturers, definitely tier 1 players are focusing on this market. How do we know that? We see them announcing production of new facilities, transformers facilities in African market. We see them making agreements with the government, with the utilities operating within the African market. So that's where you see that the tier 1 players are definitely now focusing on this market as well. Then at the end, we see that China is investing a lot in the African market. We just saw, like a couple of weeks ago, there was investment around $30 million in one of the utilities in Africa, and so we expect that this will give a very good edge to the Chinese manufacturers, which are actually targeting this African market. if you look at globally, we think that these are the markets where a lot of things are happening, where investments are going in, and that is actually impacting the transformers and the power transformers market. We'll be discussing some of these markets in detail. Actually, the biggest ones, we see the biggest install base in definitely in European market and in US market, as well as in GCC countries. And we also think that these are the markets that can be served, and they have the potential to be served by the manufacturers operating within Turkey. To start with, if we look at EU28 market of power transformers, we expect that the revenue will touch $1 billion US for the power transformers once again in 2017, and we expect this to grow in years to come. Once again, we want to evaluate that what are the key drivers. Why do we see this growth in some years shortly, and in the long run as well? What are the key drivers which are impacting the market? Right now, a lot of renewables is being added into the grids of EU28 countries, and for that, they are definitely strengthening their sub-transmission network, that is 132 kV network as well as 400 kV network as well. So grid needs to adapt according to these generation being added into the network. So this is where we think that in the short term, this will impact the market of power transformers. In the long run, we expect that replacement market will also kick in. The impact of e-vehicles, since there is legislation being made for the e-vehicles within European market, so we expect that in the long run, it will also start to kick in, and the impact will also trickle down from the distribution network towards the transmission network as well. If we summarize the market drivers, what key trends we see within European markets, we see that new additions is something that's more than replacements. Why do I say more than replacements? We'll discuss the US market later, and we'll see that there are more replacements being planned as compared to the new replacements, as compared to the new additions. If we look at some of the Central European countries, 6% was the increase in market of power transformers that we saw in year 2017 as compared to 2016. Again, we talked about the grid adaptation and the renewable generation being added into the grid. Onshore and offshore wind power projects are definitely the most amount of generation that we see going into the grid. Then we saw two different trends, two different factors which actually caused the market to go up. From the years, let's say from 2014 to 2016, the market actually went up, but the factor that impacted that market was the price increase. However, the market growth that we are seeing right now, we see it because of the volume increase, because we see that the prices are actually stabilized, they're not going up anymore. So right now we see that the volume increase is actually causing the market to go up. Then at the end, e-vehicles, again, in the long run, we expect this impact to kick in. And this is kind of an unknown factor right now even for the utilities as well. We have seen legislation being made that this million cars will see on the roads e-vehicles in one particular country, but the impact of that onto the grid, since all these vehicles will be getting connected with the distribution network for the charging process, but the impact is still unknown. We can actually look at one of the examples, UK's grid example. We can see that what impact we should expect once this penetration of e-vehicles actually comes into play. Approximately 8 gigawatts could be the peak demand in 2030 when this penetration of e-vehicles will happen. And you can imagine all these vehicles getting connected with the transmission or with the distribution network, what kind of impact it can have if the network is not strengthened. No new MVA capacities are being added. What impact would it have on the network? What we expect utilities to do to cope with these kind of peak demands because of e-vehicles, we expect them to take 3 different steps. One is demand side management. Rather than adding the capacities directly into the distribution network, we expect them to introduce intelligent networks so that this kind of peak can be shaved off. This peak can be adjusted so that there's no sudden demand for the grid. This is the first step we expect them to take. This is where we have example of National Grid actually. This is what they have planned for their e-vehicles infrastructure. Then the power quality will also be another factor that will impact the distribution grid, because all these vehicles will be getting connected with the grid. The power quality will definitely be disturbed, and utilities will be actually injecting a lot of investment in terms of the equipment that actually mitigates this problem of power quality. We expect this market to go up as well. Then at the end, distribution networks strengthening. That is definitely going to happen. And then in the long run, it will trickle to the transmission network as well. The key trends that we've seen within the European market is that tier 1 players are definitely dominating within the T&D infrastructure, within the power transformers infrastructure. The biggest market was Germany. It was roughly around $250 million for the power transformers in 2016, and we expect Germany to be the biggest market in years to come as well. Another factor is the interconnected grids. Since we know that the networks within European Union, they're getting connected, this is what is also impacting the market of power transformers. Digitization of substations, asset health monitoring are the systems we have already seen are getting implemented on the power transformers within the grids of EU 28 countries. Then if we look at the North American market, we'll be able to compare actually what's the difference, what are the difference in the key drivers that we saw in European market, and what's impacting the North American market for the power transformers. For North America's market, we expect it to be around $3 billion in 2017 to actually cross this mark. And once again, we see a steady growth in short term, and then we see a sharp growth in the long run. Once again, we'll try to break it down to different factors which we think are impacting this market. At this moment, we think that the new substations which are being added into the network is causing the market to grow up. However, the sharp increase that you saw is because of the replacement market. Why is this replacement market is so strong? According to one estimate in US, roughly around 65% or 70% of the power transformers are nearing end of life. So you can imagine how big of a threat it is for the utilities, for the system operators working within US market. So that's why all these replacements have already been planned, and we expect them to kick in, the impact to kick in and drive the market of power transformers in the long run from year 2019 onwards. Once again, if we look at the key trends as we saw for EU, one factor is that EPC companies, third-party EPC companies, even though the OEMs, they do have the capability to provide the EPC for the power transformers. However, we see that the third-party companies, they're kind of a middleman between the OEM and the utility. We expect their involvement to increase in the future years. We expect utilities to add more EPCs within their working groups. Again, asset health monitoring and digitization of substation is already happening. Some of the biggest utilities are already implementing it on all their power transformers, all their substations, and it is already in their plans. Backup reserves is one very interesting factor that we have seen in the past. We have seen that some of the natural disasters have impacted the US grid very drastically. Some of the grids, they went down, and the utilities were not able to bring them up very quickly. The reason was, again, power transformers. It's so critical, it's so tailored particularly for the network. It's not easy to just get a power transformer and get it installed within their network. This is where this kind of backup reserve program that they've initiated, that the OEMs and some of the utilities actually contribute for the backup power transformers, so that if there is some kind of natural disaster that impacts one particular grid, the other utilities, they can actually contribute in terms of the power transformers for their grid, so that they can run their system for the short run, and then the power transformers can be purchased over the long run, long period of time. Physical protection of transformers, we have seen there was one incident in California in 2013 where a coordinated attack on power transformers actually impacted the grid very badly. This can actually impact the grid very drastically in any of the grid within US, because some of the power transformers, the electricity is channeled through for a huge area. So if that gets impacted, the whole area gets down. So this is where the ballistic protection or the bullet protection of the transformers is also, we have seen from some of the tier 1 manufacturers. We saw that Siemens also introduced, actually it won some orders for the ballistic protection of transformers. So already transformers are there. Since we know they're getting replaced, they're nearing their end of life, the utilities are getting it replaced with the ballistic protection, so that transformers can withstand this kind of impact from the outside. Then we also saw some of the impacts on the bushings market within the power transformers as well. We saw that some of the asset health monitoring systems were getting implemented on the bushings as well. We know that the concept actually existed over a longer period of time, but we never saw it getting implemented within any of the utilities. But now we have seen two of the biggest utilities within the US, they have actually started a program that is going to implement this kind of asset health monitoring onto the bushing system within their network. Now let's look at the GCC market. Once again, we'll look at the market. What is the current scenario, and what are the key drivers for this GCC market? First, UAE market. Again, it's not the biggest one in terms of the install base, but there is some kind of investment going into two different voltage levels. As you can see, 400 kV network is getting revamped, is getting strengthened, and same goes for 132 kV network. Once again, it's both for power transformers going into these 400 kV and 132 kV networks of UAE's market. What are the key trends, again, which are impacting this market? GCC countries, they are getting connected with each other. As we saw for EU, the countries, their grids were getting connected with each other. Same is the impact over here. Different countries, they're connecting their grids, so that is what is impacting the power transformers market. Asset health monitoring, again, we have seen utilities implementing this system, because getting the data, getting the trends so that preventive maintenance can be applied on this critical equipment of power transformers is very important for the utilities. As we saw that 400 kV network, there was a lot of investment, power transformers investment going into that 400 kV network, because it is kind of acting as a backbone for their network. That is why they're strengthening this particular network. 132 kV is also getting strengthened rather than 220 kV, is because of the renewable generation getting connected at 132 kV network, and from one part to the other, once again, from the generation point to the load centers is kind of the reason why they have to strengthen the network. Saudi Arabia's market, again, the biggest one in terms of the install base for the GCC market. One voltage level, 132 kV, as opposed to the network we saw for UAE, is the power transformers. Our market is actually going in for 132 and 110 kV. That is a sub-transmission network for the Saudi Arabians market. Key trends, which are, once again, they're getting connected for Saudi market. Saudi network is getting connected with Egypt, with other GCC countries as well. So this is where we expect it to drive the market of power transformers. We also expect that there are some plans by the government to actually introduce new cities, new infrastructure. So T&D equipment will definitely be going into that as well. So we expect it to impact the power transformers, because they will definitely be needing power transformers for those two new cities, those new infrastructures which are being planned. Long distance transmission within the country, not the outside interconnections with the other countries, but within the country is another factor that is impacting the market of power transformers within Saudi Arabia. Then a new generation is getting connected. This is again another factor that we see, that since in order to evacuate these megawatts of generation getting connected, they have to evacuate towards the load centers. New MVA capacities need to be added into the grid. Now we'll look into the Turkish market. We'll look at it a bit differently. Rather than going directly into what are the investments being made into the different KV networks of the power transformers, we will be looking at what are the MVAs, what are the capacity additions over the past years, and how they have impacted the market, and are there any different factors which can impact the market in future years. First, just a brief introduction of the T&D as well as the generation infrastructure of the Turkish market. It's 77 gigawatt is the generation number that we saw in 2016. Roughly 75% is the private owned, and the 25% the public owned generation. Two voltages we see that investments are going in, 400 kV and 154 kV. Even though 66 kV is also within the transmission network, however, it is getting replaced actually by the 33 kV network within the country. And then the losses actually are very on the lower end for the transmission, but at the higher end for the distribution within this network of Turkey. If we look at how capacities were added in the past years, for this 154 kV network, you can see that overall, every year, new MVA capacity, new power transformers for 154 kV network were continuously being added over the past years. And if we look at the 400 kV, we do not see a continuous investment or continuous MVA capacity being added into the 400 kV. So we see that, of course, there are some new transformers over the years, but there's no consistent increase in the MVA capacity of power transformers. Should we expect it to be the same? Should we expect it to be changed? What are the factors which can impact this MVA additions of 154 kV and 400 kV power transformers? Generation, definitely, we expect this to be the biggest factor. This is the plan that Turkey has for generation mix by 2023. They have to achieve this. They plan to achieve this by the year 2023. One key factor over here is the 20 gigawatts of wind power that is being planned, as compared to 3 gigawatts of wind power at this point. So you can see that how much growth that is expected, that is planned from 3 gigawatts to 22 gigawatts only within the wind power, and other generation is definitely being planned as well. How do we see this impacting the grid, or how do we see this impacting the transmission market is this way. Right now, the transmission network cannot withstand, does not have the capability to withstand this generation being planned into the network. So without planning any new substations, without planning any new power transformers, this generation capacity cannot be added into the system. So they will have to build basin substations, they will have to build sink substations, so that the different wind power plants, different fossil fuel-based power plants can actually be connected with these substations, so that the power can be channeled from these generation points towards the load centers, specifically for the wind power. Roughly, the number we expect in next 3 years is 18 new substations being planned, and you can expect that how many power transformers will be going into those new substations. One thing to notice over here is that this transmission investment is being done beforehand, before even the investment for generation, because this can be a bottleneck for the system. If this investment is not made for the transmission, the generation plans cannot be achieved. So in order to actually cope with that generation, in order to install that generation, this infrastructure will have to be built beforehand. So that's why we expect, if there is any kind of delay in these installation of new substation, installation of new power transformer, definitely it will impact the plan of installation of new generation that we saw the plan for 2023. How do we expect this impact on the both 154 kV and 400 kV network? Is that continuous increase of 154 kV MVA within the Turkey's grid. And as we saw that 400 kV, there was not a lot of consistency, but in order to cope with this generation going into the network, we expect them to add more 400 kV MVA transformers, more substations going into the grid, consistent increase, and you can see it's almost touching 6,000 MVA per year, as compared to very inconsistent increase in MVA capacity over the past years that we saw. So this is kind of the major driver of the market, and it can be actually a bottleneck as well, as we discussed earlier. If we now step back and try to compare the way we did it for the other markets, look at the investment. So this is how the investments or the revenue numbers would look like for both the 154 kV and 400 kV in 2016 and 2017, just for the power transformers, if this MVA capacity is being added, as we discussed earlier. Then key trends that we've seen within, once again, power transformers is heavy reliance on the local products, especially the raw materials going into the power transformers. There is kind of a heavy dependency of manufacturers which are operating within the Turkish market. One key thing that we expect to happen in the future years is strict grid codes, because Turkey's network got connected with the European network and SOE's network. So we expect this to definitely impact the grid codes the utilities have at this point. They will be more strict. Any wind power plant that needs to be connected, there will be more strict grid codes for them in terms of the fluctuation. They cannot be just disconnected, a fault right through. If there is a fault, the power plant cannot just disconnect. It needs to be connected. These are the grid codes which are already existing in NSOE. So that's why the Turkish grid codes will have to be will need to be adapted according to the NSOE's grid codes. The focus is on the weak points of the grid. Again, the generation, especially the wind generation, where it is planned, it's on the weak points of the grid. Grid right now cannot withstand without any new investments on those points. So definitely those weak points is a focus of the transmission owner right now within the Turkey's grid. The two factors that we saw throughout the biggest markets, that is EU and US, that the asset health monitoring as well as the digitization of substation. The 18 substation that we discussed earlier, they are supposed to be very digitized in terms of the substations. Asset health monitoring systems will be implemented on the power transformers within those 18 substations that we discussed earlier. Now, we will take a step back from the specific markets that we discussed, the Turkish infrastructure, some of the Gulf countries, EU and US. Now we will look at the global infrastructure in terms of the supply side analysis. What is the supply and demand situation when it comes to the power transformers market? Tier 1 players right now, they are operating their production facilities roughly around 75 to 80% of capacity utilization. There is overcapacity that exists in this market. But it can be actually broken down to different factors. What actually caused this kind of overcapacity in the network? India's plans were to add a lot of generation, a lot of transmission infrastructure, but they got delayed. The manufacturers over there, they increased their production capabilities very fast. But since the plans got delayed, there was kind of a overcapacity that stayed in the market. We expect this to slightly go up in next 2 years because new production facilities are planned by tier 1 players in markets like Africa, where there is demand. As we discussed, there is a lot of investment that is going into the grid. So since these tier 1 players, they plan to install new manufacturing facilities rather than supplying the transformers from existing facilities, we expect this overcapacity to go up a bit. But in the long run, we expect this gap to narrow down. In terms of the numbers, right now, this is how it looks like. There is 30% idle capacity that exists within the network, and 70% is the utilization at this point. However, in the long run, we expect this to go down, to narrow down the gap, and the idle capacity would be roughly around 19%, and 81% would be the utilization factor in the long run. If we look at the complete infrastructure over the years, it completes supply and demand side over the years, this is how it looks. If you look at the first, that bump that we discussed, that there is going to be increase in terms of the supply side, but then in the long run, you can see this gap will be narrowing down because of all these plans going into the different grids that we discussed. Since we all saw that these replacement plans, these new substation plans, they were kicking in from the years 2019 onwards. So this is where definitely this will cause the gap between the supply and demand side to go down. One of the factors that also impact this capacity utilization were some of the natural disasters that we saw in the US market. The manufacturers, they increased their production capacity over there because there was sudden demand of power transformers going. There were a lot of power transformers which went down because of the huge impact of those natural disasters. We'll try to now summarize what we saw, what key factors we saw in a lot of the markets. They were similar. One was penetration of renewables. It was true for EU. It's true for Turkish market that the plan is there for renewables being added. However, right now the grid's capability is not good enough to withstand those generations being implemented into the grid. So before implementing those generation plans, they will have to enhance their capabilities of MVA capacity, if you will. Transformer asset health monitoring and preventive maintenance. We are seeing this all across the globe. We are seeing this, all the major utilities, they are implementing these systems specifically for the power transformers. Once again, because the equipment is so critical in nature, these systems are very handy. Imagine you have all the data trends, you have all the capabilities that your power transformer has. You know that what kind of glitch caused your power transformer to go down in some years back. You can actually predict the failure of that power transformer, and you can imagine how much downtime can be avoided if you have this kind of trend within the power transformers. supply and demand side gap we saw, there is overcapacity that exists, but this overcapacity in the long run is expected to go down since all these plans, all these replacements and new additions will kick in the long run. Yep, that's all from my side. If you have any questions, please go ahead and ask.